there, Paul Thompson here from Spitfire Audio. In this
Daddy, the mailman's here!
Well, I had hoped for something more fun than snips and XLR connectors and soldering iron tips, tip tinner, and a rack panel. I guess I better get to work. So before I get to the wiring, I thought I'd tell you why I'm doing all this. I am in my drum room slash film closet slash every junk that I can't fit into my other room goes in here, and so I've got a real tight angle so you can't see all the rest of it. But those are drums. Over here, we have a patch panel right there. All my inputs go in there. They go up the wall, through the attic, and down into the other room, and we'll jump in there now. I do love my studio space. You've seen it. I try to keep it nice and tidy for the videos. However, there is one spot that looks absolutely terrible, and that is this absolute mess of cables. And that is what I'm trying to fix with this new Patchbay, because I oftentimes have to walk back around to plug things in. I went to Whataburger for lunch today, as you can see. And so it's a giant mess. I'm trying to get all of this into this rack. I must admit that even though I can solder an XLR connector, I'm an absolute hack when it comes to electronics. I've done it and I can do a passable job, but I end up having to redo everything 4 or 5 times because I go too fast. And since it's been a handful of years, I thought I'd reach out to Joel Cameron, who you met last week when we sampled the Fun Machine, to make a short video for me describing the proper way to go about soldering XLR connectors.
I got a piece of wire here, and I'm going to use my strippers here to strip away the jacketing. And I like the strippers as opposed to some other method of cutting through the jacketing. People use razor blades and stuff, I've seen, particularly if they don't do this regularly and they're only going to do their install for just themselves only, period. They oftentimes will just use, you know, whatever they have available. And I really don't recommend that. These things only cost a few bucks at an electronics store or anything, or buy them online. They're totally worth it because unlike a razor blade or something that's just cutting randomly through the jacketing, you see this is stranded wire that I'm twisting up here. Very, very thin strands of wire. And oftentimes when you cut through jacketing with a blade as opposed to something that's made for it, see, this has holes in it. It goes around, it cuts the jacket, but it doesn't cut the wire inside. So it makes it nice and clean. So I'm going to take this and just going to tin the material, the ends, so they will not come unraveled. Now I'm going to heat shrink it. So I've got some really thin heat shrink here. Got some 3/64 of an inch heat shrink. I'm gonna cut a little piece off, put it over the drain wire. I want to cover the drain wire. I only want the tips of the wires exposed. Everything else I want covered, otherwise they may touch adjacent contacts and cause shorts and whatnot. All right, got some heat shrink here. Cut a little piece of that off and put over this whole thing. So that way every bit of the foil, a little bit of remaining foil shield and all the wire, everything is completely and totally covered. Now I'm gonna take a heating gun, a heat gun, and use it to heat the heat shrink, which will shrink when it heats, hence the name. Now, hopefully that is visible. So that's the wire part of it. Now let's prep this thing right here. Okay, so now we're looking at the XLRs. I'm going to take these solder cups and I'm going to fill them up with solder. And I'm actually going to use a pretty good amount of solder to get them really pretty full. Now, as soon as I am done putting in, as soon as I pull away the solder, I'm going to pull away the iron too, because I don't want the flux to get any hotter than it has to be. I do hope this is visible. So that's a lot of solder I'm putting in those things. So now the trick is, we're going to take these ends right here, which are tinned with solder, and then we're going to put them here. We're going to melt this solder that I've got in the cups, and then as I put the wire in, it will just melt it all together nicely when I pull the heat away. The drain is going to go in pin 1, so I've got my drain wire. So I will heat up pin 1. So get this nice and hot, and then I'll drop that in there and pull that out and wait for it to cool a little bit. When you have a lot of solder melted, it's a lot of heat, it takes longer to cool. Now, you can use whichever color wire you want for whichever lead here. These are both active leads. I'm just laying that against the solder in the cup, and as I heat the whole thing together, it all just melts. And solder is shiny when it's molten. When it congeals, it cools, it's not so shiny anymore. It's a little bit more of a dull finish. But that gives me 3 good solid connections. There's no bare wire anywhere around to accidentally touch anything else. And you just repeat that for all the connectors that you need.
So let me take a moment and walk you through my Patchbay setup. I'm going to show you what I already have, what I'm doing now, and what I hope to have in the future. So down here is my current TT Patchbay, right? I have my preamps on the top, normaled into the Apollo channels 1 through 16. And then on the other end of the TT Patchbay, I have my Apollo outputs, half of which are going to a hearback system for live recordings and such in the house. Then I have other outboard gear such as my Pultec EQ 1176. This is all already in the rack. It's not labeled, but I know where everything goes for the most part. And that's going to stay the same. What I'm working on today is this XLR Patchbay. I have my 3 rack spaces here. The middle row is the drum XLRs from the drum room. And those will then go into the preamp inputs. I'll have XLR cables that I can jump. The great thing about this is if I want to run whatever's in 1, say the kick, over to preamp 6, whatever that is, looks like it's probably an API style Yamaha preamp, I can do that. If I haven't told you about this, I can tell you about that at some point. It's pretty cool. The reason for doing a lot of this, one, is to fix up the clutter because it's really bad. I want to be able to get around my desk to the back without unplugging everything and stepping on stuff. It's bad. What I really want to do is implement what I have on these top 2 rows. This will be my 1/4-inch synth Patchbay. These will all be instrument level inputs and outputs in a completely different rack from my line level inputs and outputs, so there shouldn't be any issue there with blowing up inputs and all that. We don't want to do that. So right now, I have my Peak, my JU06, my MS-20, my Behringer D, and my Kemper out that are all going into my Ashley line mixer. And from there, I'm taking instrument level outs into the preamp of my choice. I have 2 different preamps that have instrument input, so that's what I've been doing, and it works fine. What I really want to do with this setup is to put all these inputs and outputs from the synthesizers and the Ashley line mixer into the Patchbay, and then take the outputs of the Ashley and normal them into the timeline. That way, that's just the way it goes until I break it with the cable. Output of the timeline, that's a Strymon timeline, by the way, which I do own, into a Verb, which I do not own at this point, but I have my eye on a few. You probably know which one I want to get. verb out into a pair of DIs. Now these DIs will leave the rack and go into the rack panel where I have my synth DI outputs. Here's 1 and 2. I also will have my studio XLR inputs. I do most of my recording in the studio, so I want to have 4 inputs at least, you know, vocal, guitar, and on the piano. That should cover me for the most part. And if it's not enough, I can just plug straightly into the preamp XLR inputs, which I may end up doing anyways, but I'd like to get these studio XLR inputs into another part of the room so they're not next to my chair. Not enough space to roll around with a bunch of cables. So now in the second patch bay is where the fun will begin, hopefully. I'd like to add multiple DIs. That way, I'm not just sending a stereo input into Pro Tools or whatever. I can send MIDI out to everything. Say I want to run the peak and the MS-20 at the same time. I could then split them out into different gear and then put them into different DI inputs and then into different preamps. So lots of opportunities there. Ashley has a mono out as well, so I could mix them all together and then run the mono out into some distortions or whatever. But over here is empty space. And this is what I need your help with. These need to be filled up. I'm going to give myself a goal, 3 years. All right, so let's see, how many months is that? 36 months. I got, say, 17 something, so that's every other month. I got to buy something really cool. So that might be a little ambitious and a little expensive, but we got to have goals, right? So that is what I hope to accomplish with this work that I'm doing. One, just to make things cleaner, but also to motivate me to want to use the gear that I have outside of the box. Because, as we all know, if I have to plug in cables all the time, I just reach for Echo Boy every single time, which isn't bad, but I'd like to break that habit. Well, there's my video. Not my most exciting work, but I'm hoping that future me looks back and thanks current day me for all the work that he put in, making life easier for those moments when you need to be creative and be creative fast. Hopefully I'll have access to all the stuff that I've spent so much money on. So, hope you enjoyed this. Please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And I will be back next week. I've got some stuff that I'm working on right now that I think you will like, that I will share in future videos. But until then, have a good week, and I'll see you next Friday.